Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dominions 5 Strategy. As always, I am General Confusion, and today we're going to talk about thugs a little bit more. What I've done here is I've set up a number of example thugs in these two provinces. Down here I actually need to end the turn once because I'm moving somebody between those two provinces. Down here I'm in debug mode, so I have everything available. Down here I have sort of some general use and early game thugs, including a couple that are based off of one that's based off of Pretender God, just to show her off, and then one that's based off of a super combatant chassis. And then over here, I have a bunch of more expensive and or more specialized thugs. So let's just kind of to give examples to go with that thug discussion that I posted a little while ago. Let's talk about why these thugs are what they are and how they might be useful. So first of all, let's talk about the general purpose thugs. This is one of the kind of archetypical thugs. The Colossi Storm Captain, he's geared to raid. So he's got a Girdle of Might, a Frostbrand, and a Vine Shield. Beyond that, no equipment. This equipment comes out to about 20 gems. Subtracted because, of course, Fascia has Forge bonuses. So, more like... Well, you can't get the Forge bonus on the Vine Shield, and the Vine Shield would be the trickiest part of the kit, because your Colossi Weavers do not get Nature 2. So you may end up going without this. But I put it on there kind of as it's the more expensive part of the gear. If you take it off, this guy actually only costs 8 gems, even before you factor in hammers. And he can perform light raiding and take over lightly defended provinces. So he can cast, his script is Misform, Quicken Self, Attack Rear. You can also, if you want, put in Flight to have him jump straight to the back. If you wanted to have him wearing armor, your armor in the early game options are pretty limited. There's not much that's better than his plate cuirass. You could potentially put on I don't have one of them sitting around. You could potentially put on a copper plate, which would make him shock resistant and give him the charge body effect. For raiding, you probably shouldn't need that. So this guy, you could even take the Girdle of Might off if you wanted to, but I've left it on because when he quickens, he'll be building up fatigue very, very rapidly. This guy's cheap. You can Cloud Trapeze him behind enemy armies or run him around in enemy territory. If you don't want to Cloud Trap him, you can give him a pair of Boots of the Messenger, which only require Nature 1. Pretty easy to get. In order to have his map move be like 20 plus 9, so 27. And have him hop around a lot. He's fast, he's mobile, he's cheap, he does the job he's supposed to do, which is raiding. Similarly, Ngone the Van Jarl is, well, exactly the same kind of thing. A different application, a more expensive chassis, much more durable actually, because defense score is very, very high, and cavalry get harassed down a lot more slowly. They get harassed down at half the speed of infantry. So Ngone casts Mistform and goes into combat, and that's basically all. The Van Jarl is also sacred, so whatever your bless is, they can carry that bless. Good blesses for Van Jarls include weapon blesses, something defensive like Bark Skin, which you may have as Vanheim anyway, just because it works well for your sacreds, the Van Heers. So Bark Skin would increase his prot by quite a bit. Could have an attack or defense bonus in order to make him even harder to hit or make him hit harder. But with the Frostbrand and the Hoof Attack, he's going to be hitting pretty hard anyway. The downside to the Van Jarl compared to the Colossi Storm Captain, of course, is that he cannot quicken himself, and so he can't get the double Frostbrand attack, which enables him to delete 2 full squares per round. But, as I said, he's a lot more durable because he has 26 defense skill, and overall pretty solid. The Colossi Storm Captain is not sacred and so cannot be blessed unless you put a Shroud of the Battle Saint on him, which of course takes his armor off, and I would say probably isn't worth it. Even if you have a Regeneration Bless, it's still only 3 hit points per round. Having higher prot is better than that. In the late game, if you wanted, you could gear these guys with Armor of Knights or similar, prot boosting abilities, items rather, in order to make them more durable. We've also got, this is an example of a kind of early mid-game-ish Mekonean thug, and you may be noticing a theme. Most of the thugs here are based off of giant chassis with a lot of HP. You also need kind of high base stats, but this Polemarch has a Girdle of Might for reinvigoration, a Flask of Holy Water to carry a bless. This would probably be either a regeneration bless or some kind of attack or defense boosting bless. Not regeneration only if you're really planning around Polemarch thugs. Unless you're doing that, it would probably be minor blesses at most, and possibly dormant or imprisoned minor blesses depending. A copper plate to give him shock resistance. a Frostbrand, and a Golden Hoplon, because Golden Hoplons are relatively cheap from Akone. They only cost 8 gems, and then you can use a hammer on them as well. And they give you a very high parry value, so they buff his defense pretty significantly. His total defense is 23, his protection is 17. His weakness is actually magic resistance, so you can't really deploy this guy against big armies because he'll get zapped by spells. But he can cast Iron Will on himself. He's got Reinvigoration 3, and after Earth Power is Fatigue negative. And of course he has the Blessing, which, like I said, I don't have a Blessing right now because I just used a placeholder god. But whatever Bless effect you want can be in there. Like I said, I would probably recommend relatively low level effects. If you took like Earth 4, Fire 4, you could potentially give him Reinvigoration and ditch the Girdle of Might, which would save you a few gems. And then give him like plus attack skill or something like that, or some kind of leadership buff, although he doesn't really need a leadership buff. In any case, his script is Earth Power, Iron Skin, Temper Flesh, and Fire Shield if you want it, in some order depending on what you expect to face. Iron Skin and Temper Flesh will push his prot and general resilience against attacks up very high. His prot will end up being about 25, and with Temper Flesh he'll only be taking half damage after that. He's resilient against all elements to some degree, highly shock resistant. I think the Copper Plate is probably the best choice for the Polar March for this reason. He really suffers against Thunder Strikes unless you have a Copper Plate or something on him. The Summon Earth Power, of course, gives him more Reinvigoration, and the Fire Shield helps him carve through large numbers of chaff. So this guy can fight small armies, he can take provinces, he can support your armies if you're having trouble fighting people who are using elementals, because he's, you know, elementally resistant. He'll be extremely resilient against air elementals and fire elementals, although he can still be trampled because he's only size 4. The high defense skill will help, but keep in mind, I believe that trample does not take into account shield parry. So, like I said, he can still be trampled, and air elementals, if a bunch of air elementals attack him all at once, they will trample him to death. He'll be able to do damage back to them, but I think, 5 or 6 air elementals will win against this guy just because he's size 4. So keep that in mind. The others that I have here, this is an example of a very, very cheap early game counter thug. This Vanhurst is designed to counter someone who is attacking you with a large monster, an Awake Expander, a Titan, someone who's relying on having a lot of HP and a lot of protection and possibly a lot of regeneration. So a tank super combatant, essentially, of which is probably the easiest kind to do in the early game. So Vale the Vanhurst is cheap. Vanhursts are only like 150 gold, and he costs 5 gems, or less if you use a hammer or something, to have a great sword of sharpness, high armor piercing damage, good stat buffs. Overall, he's swinging with 19 attack, he does 30 AP damage per hit, and he has 21 defense skill, plus of course glamour. His script is he casts flight and he attacks large monsters, and he just hops to the back and starts chopping at them with the great sword of sharpness, ideally with 4 or 5 buddies. You deploy these guys in packs. Since they are elves and thus stealthy, the enemy probably won't see them coming. Ideally you would stage them in a province where you think they're going to move, and then pop out to attack them. And they would swarm around the enemy unit, whatever it is, the Great White Bull or Drakon or what have you, and just chop it to death. And if you have enough of them, it'll work. And it won't take too much of an investment. Now, you will lose some of these guys doing that, but you've spent very little on them, so it's worthwhile if you can kill the enemy god. Here we have an early game. These are all construction 4 and earlier. Incidentally, there are no construction 6 items in this list whatsoever. So this is an early game repel-ish super combatant kind of thing. This is a Fomorian king. He has a vine shield to entangle people attacking him. He has an enchanted spear, which is length 3, but counts as length 4 because he is large. He has a horned helmet to get an extra attack. He has a burning pearl to increase his attack skill. And he has a stone bird, which is length 5, and stays at length 5 because it doesn't get the length bonus. But so, as a result, he has pretty high attack values. He gets to repel any attack at length 3 or lower, so spear length or lower, twice. And when it's his turn, he attacks 3 times. He's also, of course, sacred and a priest, so he can bless himself. And when he blesses himself, he can give himself whatever bonus the Fomorian player has chosen to take, probably regeneration, and then either reinvigoration or some kind of other minor buff. He's resilient to all elements to a small degree. In terms of scripting, he can give himself Mist Form and Mirror Image to make himself very, very hard to hit and hurt, and then go in. In the late game, this guy will be able to cast Soul Vortex, which will make him extremely hard to kill with this setup, because with the Vine Shield active entangling people attacking him, he'll be able to continuously suck life and fatigue off everyone around him while not taking much damage in return. That said, in the late game, he'll be extremely vulnerable to magic resistance negates spells and enemy thugs or just super buffed troops hacking through his defenses, because his defenses aren't hugely quality, any of them. He kind of relies on the layering of many mediocre defenses as opposed to having 2 or 3 really good ones. And then just for fun, this is Amaterasu, the Kami of the Sun. This is the horror helmet I just kind of threw on there for fun, but this is how you expand with Amaterasu. You give her a Kitharonic Lion Pelt, you take a Bless for her, which includes, as I've said before, Fate Weaving, and I would say Fire Shield, but you could also take an attack bonus. And with that length 3 no Dachi and a high attack value, she can repel attacks, she sends people blind who attack her, and she has Awe 3, so they have to pass the Awe 3 in order to attack in the first place. This is why I had the Horror Helmet on her. If you can forge a Horror Helmet, which you're not likely to be able to do as Jomon, but you could as Shinuyama or Yomi, both of whom I believe have access to the Kami of the Sun, then now you have the Fear-Awe combo, and it's pretty high-quality Fear, too. So you're lowering everyone's morale and then forcing them to pass a really hard Awe check in order to attack you, which they're not likely to be able to do once their morale has dropped by 5. So Amaterasu can very easily sit in the middle of a pack of enemies and take little or no damage because they are all blind and or on fire and or just can't bring themselves to attack her, while she slowly cuts them down one by one, and eventually they'll fail their check and route. So this is kind of the a quirky early game god thug. A little bit dangerous, and you do have to make sure that you give her armor, because otherwise archers will ruin her. But if you can give her a Kitharonic Lion Pelt or a cheap piece of body armor and a hat pretty early, the Kitharonic Lion Pelt is probably the easiest, then you're good to go. So these are all kind of, like I said, relatively cheap, relatively early game thugs, all construction 4 or earlier, and this is kind of a spread of the things that thugs can be expected to do at this point in the game, if you have a good chassis for it. That has to be emphasized. If you don't have a good chassis for these things, then it's very hard to do these things. So if you have the Colossi Storm Captain, who is a generally high-stat, tough giant chassis that can Cloud Trapeze and cast air buffs, you can raid with him. Similarly, if you have Vanyarls, who have a naturally incredibly high defense skill, plus glamour and stealth, you can raid with them with very little equipment, and they're sacred, so they can bless themselves. If you have a Vanhurst, the Vanhurst can also bless himself. I actually forgot to script blessing on him, but yeah, you should absolutely bless them. The Vanhurst can bless himself and be used as a counter thug against enemy thugs, or can be used to do the same thing that the Vanyarl does, just worse. Vanhurst with this gear can still bless himself. He can't cast Mist Form, which makes him less effective, but he's cheaper, so it might be worth it. If you don't have one of these guys, then you're kind of stuck in this awkward position where thugging early isn't worth it, because you don't have something that can do it efficiently. You could, for example, summon a Bane, but Banes are not very good. Let's take a look at them real quick. So, Bane. Yes, high protection, decent attack and defense skill, decent hit points. Slow, however, and no magic whatsoever. So, you can gear a Bane to thug, but I'm not sure it's necessarily worthwhile. Now, Banes are pretty cheap gem-wise, 7 gems, and you could give him Frostbrand Vine Shield, and he'll clear light provinces. Especially with the Chill Aura. The Chill Aura will help him beat small amounts of province defense just fine. He's got decent defense skill, decent prot. The Vine Shield will entangle people around him. Like, okay, you could use this. He costs 22 gems, which is expensive for his utility, total. Because he costs 7 gems to summon him and then 15 gems for the equipment. You can't really use him without the Vine Shield, because with just the Frostbrand, defense skill 12, he'll get chipped down, even by relatively small numbers of weak units. He really does have to have some method of stopping attacks from reaching him, which he doesn't have naturally. So, you know, it can be a little bit of an issue. But with this gear, if you don't have another option, yes, you can thug with this guy. He's just more expensive than this guy, because he costs 7 gems instead of 200 some odd gold, and usually it's easier to come up with the gold. Not always, but usually. Now let's talk about let's talk about these 3 thugs over here. They're all set up to do, well, 2 of them are set up to do pretty similar things. Enceladus here is a late game, I don't know why he's horror marked, ignore that. Enceladus is a late game anti-army thug for Makone. So he's got an Amulet of Anti-Magic, so pushes magic resistance up to 20, Ring of Regeneration, Boots of the Messenger, so he's his reinvigoration is 3, so when he casts Summon Earth Power, he will be fatigue neutral. Elemental Armor, which is cheaper for Makone and gives him resistance against every element. A Horror Helmet, a Shield of Gleaming Gold for the Awe, and a Frostbrand. You could also replace this with a Firebrand, and probably Makone would, because Makone likes Firebrands and it's easy for Makone to forge them and they do more damage. But the Frostbrand gives a little bit of cold resistance, so, you know, up to you. In any case, he's got the Fear-Awe combo, so he's hard to attack. He has Regeneration, he's regenerating 4 hit points around. He is Sacred, so he can be blessed if you bring somebody onto the field who can bless him. He'll be fatigue neutral once he casts Summon Earth Power, and he's resistant to all elements. So this guy, on top of that, he has Protection 22, Defense Skill 22. He's hard to kill. His script is Temper Flesh, Phoenix Pyre, Earth Power, Iron Will, and then probably I would also cast Iron Skin. That would push him up to like 27, 28 prot, something like that. It does mean that he has to have, you know, some way to not be attacked very early. But he could certainly also cast, you know, Iron Skin here. The downside to that actually is that the main downside is that he would then go down to Shock Resistance 5, and Shock Resistance 10 is more valuable than Shock Resistance 5. But he could cast Stone Skin or something, some way of buffing up his prot just a little bit higher. The end result of this, however, is that, I'd probably actually just cancel that. He ends up with pretty high magic resistance, fatigue neutral or slightly fatigue negative, I forget which, I think it's just neutral. And he has Phoenix Pyre active, so if he's ever actually killed, he just explodes and respawns somewhere and has a few turns of walking to bring his fatigue back down before he gets back into melee combat. So this is kind of a budget Laestrygonian Tyrant super combatant. He's not as good, but he's pretty solid, and against most, you know, against an army without very, very significant magical backup geared to stop him, he'd have pretty good odds of coming out on top. In terms of gems, he's actually not all that bad for the utility. The Shield of Gleaming Gold costs 8 gems for Makone, 5, call it 10 for a Firebrand, so 18, 28. This, once again, is reduced by 20%, so it doesn't cost 15, it actually costs 12. So 28, 40, 45, 55, 60 gems, all told. Expensive, but possibly worth it if you can get him onto an appropriate target. You would not gear someone this heavily to do anything except fight in large army battles. There would be some of your troops on the fields, a couple of mages potentially that would be able to layer more buffs on him as well as the troops. And essentially what would happen is he would charge into the enemy army and gum them up and absorb a lot of attention while not dying, which would be, you know, could be very useful. Or he could potentially fight an army by himself. His biggest problem would actually be morale in that case, and what you might want to do is you may want to swap one of these items out for a Burning Pearl, or give him a Dragon Helmet instead of the Horror Helmet for the morale, because morale would be key in that case, since he has no way to go berserk. The other two are both variants of anti-super combatant thugs. This Colossi Storm Captain is kind of a generic equipment, okay? And this guy actually does require construction level 6. He's equipped with 2 Axes of Hate, which do pretty decent damage with a high attack bonus, and when they do damage, they inflict 20 armor negating fatigue. He can also quicken himself. This Colossi Storm Captain, I forgot to script him, but he can cast Quickness, which means he gets to attack 4 times with his Axes of Hate. What that means is, if he goes up against a buffed super combatant, there's a possibility, a pretty decent one actually, that in the first round he will knock them out. That they'll go to 100 fatigue. Because his 4 attacks, he'll get 4 20 plus DRN rolls against their DRN, and the odds of pushing them over 100, especially once they've spent some fatigue casting buff spells, is not inconsiderable. On top of that, of course, he can mist form, mirror image himself, he can give himself flight, so he can attack them quite early, probably while they're still in the middle of their buff cycle. He has those Boots of Quickness, as I said. He has Armor of Knights, just to give him a chance of surviving one round of counterattacks in case he needs to, and a Burning Pearl to push his attack value up, because he needs that high attack value, especially because he's not ambidextrous, so wielding 2 of these is lowering his attack slightly. If you wanted to, and you have the blood available, you could also give him a Ring of the Warrior to push his attack up even a little bit higher, up to about attack 25. This guy, this is a Scrati of the Niflheim, Jotunheim, Utgard line of nations, and he's built to do a similar thing. This is an anti-super combatant. He's wearing a Shroud of the Battle Saint. You would probably have a Regeneration Bless. So, he ends up with Prot 18, which is respectable. And he ends up regenerating at 20%, which in his case would be 11 hit points per turn. He has a Ring of the Warrior to buff his attack. He has a Pendant of Luck to help negate attacks from enemy super combatants that would hit very, very hard. He has Boots of the Messenger to make him fatigue negative. He's wearing a Horned Helmet, which gives him an extra attack. He's got a Dusk Dagger, which all of the nations in that line can forge very easily, and which does armor negating damage, and also has a chance to cause profuse bleeding, which is one of those things that does kill super combatants unless they're prepared for it. And he has a Flesh Eater, and the Flesh Eater's the main thing it does is it gives the enemy a chest wound, in addition to hitting quite hard, which will give them fatigue and lower their strength. It also, however, sends him Berserk when he's wounded. It gives him Berserker +3, which will, of course, push up his attack skill and protection even higher once he's hit for the first time. So this guy, because he has water and blood magic, the blood magic actually isn't super relevant, but the water means he can quicken himself, cast Liquid Body, which halves the incoming damage, although it makes him slower, and Breath of Winter, which gives him a cold aura, which will rack up more fatigue on the enemy. He'll then attack, and this Jotun Werewolf he's pretty heavily geared, it's pretty expensive. 10 gems, that barely counts, honestly, but 15, 20, 25, 30 gems and 10 blood slaves, so fairly expensive, but a lot cheaper than most super combatant builds, and he'll beat a lot of super combatant builds. A Laestrygonian Tyrant can probably kill him just because they get so many attacks, they'll overwhelm his defenses and wipe him out in a couple of rounds. But most less powerful super combatants, the fight will end up, it won't be a very long fight, but it'll end up with him inflicting a ton of damage because when he quickens himself, he gets to attack 8 times a round, at over 20 attack for all except the gore, and they're all hitting quite hard. Plus, the Dusk Dagger, as I said, is completely armor negating, so your protection just does not matter. So he's going to charge in, and in the first round, he's probably going to do something like 100 damage. So unless you have, the hit points and defenses to soak that, you're just going to die immediately. And even if you can soak it once, you're probably going to die in the second round. The weakness of this guy is obvious. Magic resistance. If he's targeted by Soul Slay, Enslave Mind, any of that stuff, he's just going to fall over and die. Magic resistance 14 is enough to resist, on average, I think 3 casts with no bonus of any kind. It's more than 3. It's more like 5, I guess. So any number of astral mages casting astral spells at him will probably take him out in short order. If he runs into other blood mages, they will cast Life for a Life at him and he will die. Or Leech, or Bleed, or anything. Well, Bleed actually wouldn't kill him because he does regenerate. But in any case, this guy is specially designed for killing super combatants. He can, however, also take enemy provinces. With protection 18 and 20% regeneration, it's unlikely, especially that 6 to 11 province defense will be able to kill him past his 8 attacks before he wipes them out. He'll be regenerating the damage that they do pretty quickly. His prot will shrug off most basic attacks, and he'll just be killing them so quickly that they won't really be able to stop him, because he can target 4 different people every round twice. So, and of course, if they do manage to push him down, he is still lucky, so he might still be able to soldier through it. And he's fatigue negative. So, just a few little thoughts, a few little examples of how you might thug and for what purpose. Ranging from the very cheap, like this guy's very cheap. In fact, you could, if you really wanted, even take that off, just send him out with the Frost brand. At this point, he's, 5 gems and 175 gold. very, very low investment. If he dies, oh well, too bad. If he takes 2 or 3 provinces, he's definitely paid for himself. Slightly more expensive. This guy's a lot more durable, will last you a lot longer. If he's caught out by a counter, you've lost more, but ye old basic province defense is not going to be able to kill this Van Jarl almost ever. Occasionally, you might get unlucky and lose him if he happens to take a hit that inflicts a terrible affliction like profuse bleeding or cripple or feeble-minded or something. You might effectively lose him, but beyond that, he'll be fine. This guy's more expensive. This guy is designed to fight early game enemy armies where they don't have a whole lot of magic support, but they have troops. This guy can take on a lot of troops without too much trouble, although he will struggle against mages or against high-quality sacreds with very high attack values that he struggles to repel. Amaterasu, of course, is designed for cheeky early game expansion. Later on, if you want, you can slap that horror helmet on her, and then she can do some work against armies as well, but her main value is that with bless effects on her, she can solo pretty much any melee province without worrying too much. Crossbows will still worry her a lot, but heavy cavalry, barbarians, who cares? Over here then, the more specialists, this is an example of a late game anti-army thug, almost a super combatant, but not quite. And then these guys are designed, as I said, to kill enemy heavy thugs and super combatants, and they'll do it quite well. The variant of this is that you can equip someone of this caliber with, actually he doesn't need the boots of quickness because he can quicken himself. I don't know why I did this. The boots of quickness are useful if you do this with Bane Lords, which most nations can summon. If you can summon a Bane Lord, stat-wise, Bane Lords are pretty comparable to Colossi Storm Captains. In fact, they're a little bit tougher, actually. And you can give them double Axe of Hate, or the variant is double Serpent Kriss. Serpent Krisses are armor piercing, and they inflict 35 poison every time they hit. So if you're going up against a super combatant that isn't poison resistance and or doesn't have a lot of regeneration, the Serpent Krisses can score a kill even if your Bane Lord dies, just because they stack up a ton of poison very, very quickly. You know, in the first round, you're likely to hit the 100-point poison cap, and then they'll just be taking about 10 hit point damage around every round, no matter what. So if they don't have a lot of regeneration, the poison can actually kill them even through a basic level of regeneration, because it does more damage than they regenerate every round. But this guy is designed, as I said, we can take those off, so he's actually cheaper than that. This guy is designed to run up to a super combatant and send them asleep, and then chop them to death while they're sitting there snoring. This guy is designed to run up to a super combatant and overwhelm them with sheer raw damage output, and is pretty good at it. Most super combatants, I think, would be hacked down by this guy pretty quickly. Defense, pretty low. If he's up against a large army of kind of moderately quality troops, he might die, because he might just get tar-pitted and slowly whittled down even through his regeneration. With only defense skill 11 and prot 18, that's very possible. However, against small armies or province defense, he'll work just fine, and of course against those pesky super combatants that your armies might have trouble dealing with, he'll cut them to ribbons, as long as they're not casting astral spells at him. So, I hope this has been interesting, or I hope this has answered some questions you may have still had about thugs, and how to build them to do different purposes. Obviously, there are many other thug builds that I haven't talked about, and that I haven't shown off here. These are just some basic examples. But it's something to think about. I personally think that thugging is a lot of fun. I think thugs are in many ways the most fun part of Dominions, and very often I'll do it even when it isn't really ideal, just because I enjoy it. It helps keep my interest in the game high. So hopefully this has been interesting to you. Once again, thanks to Perun for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video, and I will see you all in the next one.